We're very, very pleased that you're here with us today.
Thank you.
We're doing an oral history interview with John C. Cobb, who is Professor Emeritus of Theology from Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California, and Claremont Graduate University. He's also the founding director of the Center for Process Studies, which is located in Claremont, California. And with us today is Kate Common, who is a graphic designer and a doctoral candidate in theology at Boston University School of Theology. And I'm Mary Elizabeth Moore, and I get the privilege of just participating in this interview. Kate will be in and out, so don't be alarmed when she disappears. John, thank you so much for doing this. We're really pleased.
Well, I'm honored to be asked.
It's going to be wonderful just to have a conversation about your life.
Good.
This is really your life.
I think it's my favorite topic.
Good, I'm glad. It's one of mine too. So this is really just a time for you to tell your life story, but I'll ask a few questions to spark your story. Could you begin by sharing some of the significant people and events and places in your life?
Well, the most significant people in my life are my parents. I think that's true for a lot of people, but I've, in recent years, thought about what my basic values are, what I'm concerned about. That's where they came from, I'm sure. Of course, they reflected a wider community, and that community supported it. But there were other features of that community that were different. I mean, we come from a Southern family, but I never heard a word of prejudice or disparagement of people for ethnic reasons from my parents. And that's just an illustration of why I say my parents rather than speak of the larger community. Right. Of course, that doesn't mean that there haven't been changes and changes and changes. So the most significant events, I think, are the ones that brought about those changes. And I had the very unusual experience that when I was in the Army in World War II, I was for the first time in my life, I was with intellectuals. I was in the Japanese language program. And in New York City, there were a couple of places that you could study Japanese. And people who knew they were likely to be drafted decided they'd rather spend their time in something like that rather than other roles in the Army. So some very thoughtful Jews, and mainly almost all Jews and Catholics.
Interesting.
Of the New York variety, and of course of the more intellectual segments of that culture were my fellow soldiers. And that just opened up to me a world that I had no notion existed.
Do you mind saying more about what you were actually doing together, and also if you remember any particular moment that you realized what this meant to you?
I can say what we were doing together was studying Japanese, but no, there was no one moment. It was simply progressive awareness that the way I thought and how I felt, which I thought was sort of at the cutting edge of things, was a few centuries out of date from the point. And that was an important realization.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, I wouldn't have been able to say it but of course I grew up in Southern piety. And Southern piety, from the point of view of my fellows there, was an interesting sociological phenomenon that, of course, had roots in particular periods of American history, that it still existed was a little bit strange to them. The people, they were very nice, but I just realized I was an interesting sociological phenomenon. That if you look at it through modern eyes, I wouldn't say these folks were totally modern. Many of them were very faithful Jews and Catholics and so forth. But Protestantism as a whole was a kind of aberration, and Southern Methodist piety was. So it's hard to say any one thing. When I look back and talk about it, I say, this was my first encounter with modernity. And modernity has a history for which the Reformation is important, but not widely recognized as important by most moderns. But the break with the Middle Ages, which is then viewed as the time when religion was important, and the whole discovery of the natural world, the view that science and religion are in some kind of struggle. They'd never been in any struggle in my experience. I had not had much I knew there were a few people who were anti this and anti that, but that wasn't the culture that I grew up in. And then, of course, the whole history of literature, which is a history of sensibility, a history in which people like Blake and Nietzsche and T.S. Eliot and so forth, the issues they dealt with were ones I had not even realized were issues. I knew nothing about it. I just realized that my life and my actions were based upon assumptions that are not the assumptions of cultivated people. So that shook me up. It wasn't painful, but it meant that I felt I had to learn what this modernity was and whether, as it often seemed, it invalidated the values I grew up with. So that was a major turning point. One of the people who was my classmate would be, I think only one of them has the kind of reputation people might respond to. That's Robert Heilbronner. He wasn't a close friend, but anyway. So that would be the first time that I really questioned who I was and why I was what I was, and what that meant for my intentions and expectations in life. And that led me, because of things I heard about the University of Chicago, to decide to go there. And my job was to really understand what this modernity was.
Before you move us to the University of Chicago, could we go back to your parents? Because you mentioned that they had a huge influence on you. Would you say a little more about what kind of influence and what kind of influence this Southern piety and your experience in Japan, right? Could we step back a minute and you reflect a little bit more about the influence your parents had on you and the influence your community and your time in Japan had on you as a young person?
Well, I'll say the Japan part first. Is somewhat distinct, I think. I think the main effect of growing up in a different culture is that one does already understand that there are multiple possibilities. And because no one I knew was in any sense contemptuous of Japanese culture, so it was not that Western culture was good, Japanese culture was bad. I think I grew up with a sense of alternatives, much more than I would have if I had grown up in Georgia, where both my parents came from. So. And also, looking back, I think the beginning of my extreme suspicion of standard news and the standard interpretation, and even of acceptance of the standard authorities in various fields, and so forth, was reduced by the fact that the newspaper we got was obviously Japanese propaganda. This was back in the 30s, at a time of the worst period of Japanese imperialism. And of course, my parents were not in any way swayed by that. So we both gave the sense that a very wonderful culture could also be very vicious and lie about itself, and that a good newspaper would also be the servant of the propaganda. And you see, to this day, I tell my friends, don't believe something because it's in the New York Times. It might happen to be true, but the New York Times is a propaganda organ. And most of them just, brush me off. But I'm serious. And the confidence in authority is totally misplaced in this country, as it was totally misplaced in Japan when I was growing up. So obviously I didn't think about these things. We also had the interesting experience at school. I went to a Canadian school, and in 3 years in succession we would study British history from a British textbook, Canadian history from a Canadian textbook, U.S. history from a U.S. history book, and at home we had Confederate histories. So I couldn't help but notice that that's also, histories are also propaganda.
Yes.
So I think that's had a permanent effect on me. That my beliefs about most of what's going on in the world are not acceptable beliefs in normal society. But what did I get from my parents? I got from my parents a fundamental sense that the most important thing to do in our lives is to serve God. And God was understood. Well, I would say that what we know of Jesus was the major shaper of belief about God. I didn't grow up with any clear doctrines about all that, but, and I believed that then, and I believe it now. That's a lot to carry through life.
Huge.
And as I mentioned, my parents, I mean, of course, partly this was just growing up with people of a different ethnicity whom I fully respected, and they were our hosts. We were their guests, and they were wonderful hosts and so forth. And then my classmates, about 1/3 of them were Eurasian, and the others came from different countries, mostly English language, but not all. So, and it was a natural thing that I was not prejudiced by race. And when I went back to Georgia, it was very painful. I've never been a poet or had any poetic talents, but at one time as a child, I thought poetry was just rhyming. So I like to rhyme. And I came up with a little rhyme. Intolerance, you are a curse, and death itself far worse. Okay, I'm not recommending that as poetry, I hope you understand. But that, as a high school boy, was something I would say, says something about how I was shaped by growing up.
Yeah.
And I still feel, I mean, I'm not sure the particular comparison with death is another issue. That's a hard thing, but nevertheless, feeling-wise, that I attribute to my youth and childhood, not to my encounter with modernity. So I did not give up the values of my childhood, but nevertheless, I felt urgent need for it. I mean, belief in God. Now, most of the people in the unit, as I say, the Jews and the Catholics, many of them were serious believers, not all. But I did realize that modernity was essentially atheist. That was a cornerstone. And since my life was theocentric, my values, if they want no God, I needed to rethink things. So I went to Chicago, and there I went into the humanities division. And within the humanities division, I went into the committee on the analysis of ideas and the study of method, which was better than going into a particular department for me, because modernity was in all the departments. So my project was to study all the reasons for not believing in God.
Oh. And where did that lead you?
Well, it led me to the realization that the lack of belief in God is not a matter of particular arguments, but of the whole way modernity has been shaped. And that might have really made it impossible for me to believe. I did go through a period of that I describe it. My prayers bounced off the ceiling. Just that was gone. But when you ask about people, I had the great good fortune that from my very first quarter in Chicago, I had a class with Charles Hartshorne.
Oh.
Now, of course, we didn't use the word postmodern, but here was a man who certainly understood modern philosophy, and more broadly, I mean, he was a cultivated man. It wasn't just the philosophical. But he understood it, and he had fundamental arguments against its most basic assumptions. So at the same time I was being sucked into modernity, I also realized one could know it and critique it. And that has been what I've done the rest of my life.
To be in University of Chicago, because you spent a few years there.
Well, Chicago at that time, unlike any university I know, encouraged intellectual activity. And so I just assumed that's what universities did. It's been very painful to me to realize that's extremely rare in higher education, but it was what I needed. And I transferred to the divinity school. This was even more dramatic. That the dean was Bernard Loomer, and he was open to your thinking anything. You could be a fundamentalist or an atheist or totally anti-religious, but whatever you were, you need to be able to justify it. And if you could justify whatever it was you wanted to believe, then education had been successful. And I understand that's not practical as a school of theology policy. You understand? I'm not trying to push it, but it was exactly what I needed.
It's certainly not impossible.
Well, I mean, for a whole institution to be based on that. That was a wonderful moment in history.
Yeah.
Now at Chicago, it's all based on religious studies, which means none of that discussion and no encouragement to think about what you believe yourself. No. You can tell I have strong prejudices about the disappearance of theology from, even to a large extent, from seminaries. Is for me a mark of culture. It isn't a problem just for the church, it's a problem for the whole culture.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think my freedom to disagree with all the dominant ideas and practices of the major institutions of my time are probably aided and abetted by my childhood experience. But encouraged by my life experience.
Yes.
I mean, even I was very much against Japanese imperialism. So I had no hesitation volunteering for the Army, and that's what I did. Went into this unit. But the newspapers were engaged only in propaganda. I just mean I haven't lived through a period when I trusted when I thought newspapers were a source of information about what was happening.
Right. But you were also able to distinguish between Japanese culture and history and Japanese imperialism.
Yes. And unfortunately, many people in the world proved to be able to distinguish between Americans and American policy. You know, Americans are often popular in places where American military activity and economic activity is recognized as having been very destructive.
Yes. Yes. Well, then tell us what unfolded when you left Chicago.
Well, I left Chicago at just the time that lots of other GIs were getting their degrees and prepared to teach, and when enrollment in colleges was declining because the wave of GI. So there were no jobs. And that is something that has been to some extent true for a long time, and it's gotten worse recently, so people can understand. And I did not get at Chicago a professional degree. I got only the MA and the PhD. I had no prejudice against working in churches. And I joined the North Georgia Conference and asked for an appointment. I won't say out of desperation, but I did need to support the family.
Right.
And I was grading papers in the correspondence course of study and taking classes in the correspondence course of study at the same time. And I had only 1 year in which I was a pastor, and that I had 6 churches, and that was a half-time job.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
They were supposed to pay me $400. Even if you counted the value of every chicken and every egg, you wouldn't get up to that. But I still had to give 10% of the $400 to the district superintendent.
$400 a month? A year?
A year.
What the?
What year was that?
Well, that's
Roughly.
Roughly that would be 47. No, 50.
Wow.
I graduated. I mean, I got my PhD. I finished my work on my PhD at 50.
Wow.
So it was in Appalachia, the northwest corner of Georgia. And I was very grateful to my predecessor who had not only built a residence, a parsonage, but had insisted on putting an inside toilet.
Wow.
Now this had split the largest of the churches on the circuit. So I was glad I didn't have to go through that. My job was to bring about healing after this split.
Yeah.
He had not finished the building, so there were no tiling on the back, which meant that the water froze in the well, I think we're getting off on topics that are not quite what you want to focus on.
Well, I ask about important people and events, so here you go.
Okay. Well, that was an important year, but not in terms of my career as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then I taught at Young Harris College. I was teaching half-time that first year. And that was important in the sense that I expanded my education. I taught whatever nobody else wanted to teach. Or I never had a course in American governments, but I taught American. I'd never had a course in psychology. I taught psychology, etc.
I've heard you say in the past that when they asked you to teach chemistry, you drew the line.
When they asked me to teach chemistry, I said, "Is there a lab?" I could teach what was in the book, but I think one needs a little experience with these chemicals before you teach. Or you carry a bunch of students in. Yes, I did refuse to do that.
And what did that time at Young Harris do for you in terms of your own life awareness?
I mean, we had a perfectly happy experience, but I can't really say that it was important.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned your family.
Yes.
So who comprised your family at that point in time?
Oh, well, we had two sons. One of them was born while we were in North Georgia.
So you and Jane and two boys.
And then finally the Chicago connections kicked in. The Chicago epoch, what I call understanding a university as a place for intellectual reflection, ended. Robert Maynard Hutchins left. And the man who had been president of the university, who had previously been dean of the Divinity School, Ernest Cadman Caldwell, also left Chicago and went to Emory. And he created an institute to prepare people to teach in liberal arts colleges. Because the new organization of the university around academic disciplines is teaching people how to do research, but not the liberal arts. Again, you can see my feeling is much more favorable to the liberal. I don't think the liberal arts are the right way of going now, but they're much better than research. Research is fine for a specialized group, but to think the purpose of all higher education is research is never mind. I have strong feelings about what has happened in higher education in my lifetime and in my adulthood. So he created this Graduate Institute for Liberal Arts, and you know something about that, I'm sure. So I got acquainted with, but he didn't have any money, so he had to get people on other people's. So I was appointed to the School of Theology. The first thing I had to do when I got there was to sign a document promising not to teach theology.
Really? Why was that?
That was because, and I really don't hold it against him, in those days, deans could appoint people without consulting faculty. And I'm glad that can't happen now. But Caldwell had persuaded the dean of the School of Theology to do that during the summer. And when there were two people teaching theology there, and when they came back and discovered they had a colleague, one of them was very upset. He was quite conservative, and not in a way I consider negative. So
Yeah.
I almost hate to tell this story because it sounds like I'm criticizing him.
Yeah.
But he did not trust the University of Chicago as a source for the kind of thing he thought theology should be, and I can understand that. So he complained vigorously, and this was to placate him. I could teach historical theology,
Ah.
and I specialized in American theology. Then I taught a third time at the School of Theology, and a third time in the Department of Philosophy, and a third time in the Institute of Liberal Arts, and the Great Books courses. So it was a wonderful time to expand my education.
Yes. Yes.
But I was really more at home in the philosophy department. At one point, for some years, Charles Hartshorne was my colleague.
Really? He had been your teacher in Chicago.
Yes. That was when that was the really important relationship.
Say more about that.
The importance of that. Well, it was because since modernity means what's happening, and when it means what's happening in the contemporary world, and one has been taught that one should think in the most contemporary way possible, that are very difficult to resist modernity. So the realization that one could know it and critique it was, if I hadn't had that experience, I don't think I could have been a theologian.
Yeah.
Because theology as such does not belong to the modern world.
Say more.
Well, to whatever extent theology has to do with belief in God, the modern university, you get in trouble if you bring God in to explain anything. That's true even in the schools of theology to some extent.
Yeah.
Well, I think God is an explanatory element in everything, but I can't. I mean, that's not part of the modern world. That's a critique of the modern world. But to criticize the modern world for a young person who is just beginning to understand it, one's hardly in position to do that. So it was very important to have the encounter with someone who was in position and was ready to talk to any spokesperson for the modern world at any time and take him on. Now, whether he won all the arguments, that depends on the observer.
Yes.
Rudolf Carnap was also on the faculty. Okay, he represented modernity in its baldest and most extreme form. He was a leading positivist philosopher. Hartshorne was glad to argue with Carnap at any time Carnap was willing to argue with him. I don't think Carnap particularly wanted to argue with him. On the whole, moderns haven't done a good job of defending modernity against postmodernity. We didn't call it that at that time, but that's what it was. So it's just made all the difference for my life that I could take an independent stance toward modernity.
Yes, and ask really hard questions. So where did that lead you then? Where did that lead?
Well, that led to a career as a process theologian. Hartshorne was the most influential teacher of a broadly Whiteheadian. Hartshorne developed most of his thinking before he met Whitehead. So to think of him as Whiteheadian is, it could be misunderstood.
Yes.
he didn't spend his time interpreting Whitehead. He spent his time telling how he thought. But he would often refer to Whitehead. He had been Whitehead's assistant, not his student. And he'd also was very, very much influenced by Charles Sanders Peirce. He and Weiss had edited the writings of Peirce. So it was not pure Whitehead by any means. In fact, it was interesting that he gave us a rationalistic version of process thought. In the divinity school, there was a lot of process thought, not much. Whitehead was admired and appreciated. And after I left, Loomer actually taught seminars on Whitehead. So I'm not saying you couldn't get Whitehead, but they were much more empiricist. So I got a radical empiricist version of process thought, and I got a rationalist version. And in due course, I decided that Whitehead's own version, which is a speculated version, is better than either of those. So I'm not a product of Chicago in the sense of following any one teacher, but I'm a product of Chicago in the sense of being told, okay, think for yourself, make your own judgments. And I was impressed by my teachers, both as empiricists and as rationalists, but also neither one of those seemed quite right. I think speculation simply means developing theories and testing them. That's what scientists do. And to continue the scientific method, even in dealing with the more ultimate questions, is what Whitehead did. And I can't improve on that. So those were very formative. Formative years for me. But I did not get to teach process thought at Emory. I first taught that when I followed Caldwell to Claremont. But when I had a chance, then I began to do it.
So say something then about your Claremont journey.
Caldwell is one of the very influential people in my life, but more institutionally than by his actual teaching. I didn't have a class with him. He was a New Testament scholar. But you've sensed from what I've said that I have strong feelings about what education should be, in distinction from what it is. And probably one way and another, Cobb was very much the reason for that. Then secondly, Caldwell created a climate of being very ambitious for the school. He wanted it to be pioneering, and I think he was more interested in it being creative and pioneering than exactly how it was creative and pioneering. But that precisely meant that faculty had great freedom. And he created a climate in which one could take initiatives and be morally supported. He didn't have any money, so there was never any financial support. I like to say that he and Jim Robinson sat down together one day and decided, let there be an institute for antiquity and Christianity. And lo, there was an institute. Then they found a room that they
put a sign on the wall.
And so it was a context in which as I developed an interest in developing an institution to support and promote process thought, that was support. That was not until after he had left.
Yes.
So I think that was a great period.
Mm-hmm.
And very few professors have the opportunity to play a role in creating the institution in the way that we did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jim Robinson and I became close partners, much more than we had been at Emory. At that time, I thought that the most important theological work was still being done in Germany. And Jim Robinson had an inside relationship to German theology. So at one time, we had half of all the habilitated German professors teaching theology in the United States.
Wow.
In Claremont.
Wow.
And for a brand new school, we were on the map in Europe in a way we were not on the map in the United States. But nevertheless, my view that Germany was still the center of theological creativity was shared sufficiently so that if your school was the center of German theology in the United States, that gave it status.
Yes.
So in looking back, it's really quite remarkable that a school with no money and no history in a few years became recognized as, I don't know how to put it, I mean, but as a factor in American theological education.
Yes.
I think that would be safe to
Yes.
say. So that was fun.
It sounds wonderful.
I've had a very good life. Again and again, I found that my habits of thinking needed to be radically readjusted. I'll give two examples, both of them which relate to Ignacio Castrera. I learned that liberation theology, this was just at the beginning of the movement, was against development. And I told Ignacio, no, I'm all for liberation, but surely we need development. People are very poor, you know. And he really helped me to understand fairly quickly that development didn't really mean what it was sold to us as. And I greatly appreciated that. And of course, that helped me to get into the world of economics, and that has been an important part of my career. So I don't mean it's only because of that event, but you can see it's
right.
And then a couple of years later, after Ignacio knew what was going on in Latin America, in the Liberation Front, and the people involved, I think better than anyone else in the United States. And he could have been the leading liberation or teacher of liberation theology in the United States. And then he began talking so much about gays and gay rights. And I said, Ignacio, that's fine. I'm not against any of that. But don't you have a plateful already? Later, I understood that when Martin Luther King took on anti-Vietnam War activities, that was the way that other people responded to him. You know?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. But he said, yes, but as a liberation theologian, one needed to identify with the most oppressed. And in the United States, gays and lesbians are the most oppressed. Well, that was, again, opening up
Yes, yes.
horizons, breaking habits of thought.
Yeah.
Feminists had a harder time with me because I grew up in a world in which women were extremely powerful. On the mission field, the women were better financed, better equipped than the representatives of the regular mission board. And I had women relatives and friends in there who were stronger people than the men I knew, and were doing more, had more power, you know. And then in school, the girls always seemed to me to be a little bit better than the boys. They got better grades. So what was this all about? Well, eventually I caught on. But
what helped you catch on to that?
I think it was gradual. We had a period at Claremont when, especially due to Nell Morton and Ann Bennett, we really had some wonderful. I think Claremont became one of the major centers for the development of feminist theology. And I was officially the advisor of a good many of the women who were involved. And
Yes.
obviously, I got a good education. I can't point to someone. I had no advanced prejudice against, and indeed, what I first heard was being advocated by Mary Daly and Rosemary Ruther, especially, all sounded like good process theology to me. So I didn't have to adjust my theology dramatically. My experience with Mary Daly may have been, if I'm going to focus on one thing, we had been she had accepted the invitation to speak at a lecture series in Portland as the Roman Catholic speaker, and I was going to be there as the Protestant speaker. And then before the event, there had come the march out of the chapel and her rejection of Christianity. And so forth, but she came on. So she was not a representative of the Catholic Church. But she was quite extreme. I sat beside her at dinner and tried to carry on a conversation. I don't talk about anything except feminism. So then I tried to talk to her about feminism. I don't discuss feminism with men. It's not a way of encouraging, but it is consciousness raising.
Yes.
And after she spoke, there was a time for questions, and a forest of hands went up. She said, "I don't take questions from men." Okay. And the great majority of the hands went down, and there was some really good. Well, just that the importance of being radical.
Yes.
Breaking the habits and so forth.
Yes.
That was a real learning experience for me. One of her disciples introduced me. The introduction consisted of reading a poem called Monsters, which was about men, and then saying, "John Cobb will speak to you."
Oh, that's funny. That's good.
Yes, that is. But, all of that is consciousness raising.
Yeah, it is. James Cone described that as the necessity of iconoclasm.
Yes.
To break patterns of thought.
That's right. No, I assure you, I don't have any. In fact, finally, we had to pick a topic in advance that we could both talk about, and the topic was androgyny. And so she spoke and I spoke, and then it was time for questions. And men asked questions. Of course, she wouldn't answer them. But I think my way of answering the questions finally made her have some confidence in me, because since that time, whenever she was in trouble, she wanted me to write a letter.
Oh, that's interesting. Very. Wonderful. I've also heard you tell a story about a very big influence that one of your sons had on you.
Yes. That's another, probably for me, the most important occasion for, I say, the scales falling off my eyes. And that is in spite of the fact that process thought in general, and Whitehead in particular, is overcoming the dualism of nature and history. When I wrote a book called A Christian Natural Theology, I never mentioned nature.
Oh.
Okay. You see, theology was simply defined in a way that left nature out. That had been true for a long time, but it was intensified by the influence of Immanuel Kant.
Yeah.
That really established the dualism for Protestants. Catholics, fortunately, never succumbed quite as badly, but I don't think the Catholic record is terribly good, so I'm not. But so the scales were fastened firmly, again, by modernity, and I still hadn't appreciated that until Cliff got me to read. The book was The Population Bomb.
Wow.
It's a rather bad book, but a very effective and important one. And once I understood what he had understood some months earlier, that a whole society is heading toward a cliff, that seemed to be the most important topic for me to work on.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say other people should give up gender issues or sex issues. It's never that I've wanted to minimize them. And I think when I was first converted, I did have some tendency to belittle everything else. And I think that's understandable, but I fairly quickly recognized, no, that ain't it. We got to see it all in an interconnected whole. Thank you for that. That is very much the most important of my many conversions.
You've already talked about this as you've gone along, but much of what you've described represents an emergence of your vocation and changes in it over time.
That's right.
Would you like to say anything else about your own sense of vocation as you took this journey?
My sense of vocation when I was studying for my PhD was to help other young people formulate a faith that took account of modernity without being swallowed by it. Okay. And I've never given that up, but it has not been the way I would describe my vocation. And so since the conversion to the need to save the world from self-destruction, my vocation I would describe in those terms. And even whether it would be pursued by teaching or in some other way was secondary to the goal. So that is a real shift of vocation. And in many ways, I just feel that Providence is at work because my new sense of vocation did not make Whitehead's philosophy and theology seem less important to me, but rather more important. It was a remarkable fact that the philosophy that had meant so much to me in dealing with the modern world, even though I had basically ignored one very important aspect of it, turned out when I realized how terribly much we have suffered from our neglect of nature, to already have everything I needed. I just needed to get more deeply into it in order to move forward. And that it sort of encourages me to think of Providence, that there is a wisdom beyond my wisdom that has some effect on what happens along the way. Another area in which this is dramatic is that, of course, in the work of the Center for Process Studies has always focused not on Whitehead's philosophy as such, but on how to think about other issues from a Whiteheadian point of view. And we never, in our remotest imagination, thought that this had anything to do with China. And then when it turned out that China was much more interested in process thought than the United States or Europe or any of the other places, their interest, because Marxism is sort of the one major philosophy that intends to be practical in the sense of really restructuring the world. Marxists, even people who have been through Marxism in China, of course, was so hurt by the results of the Cultural Revolution that it couldn't push the Marxists any further. When they heard about another philosophy, their interest was, well, how would we organize society? How would we do things if we followed that? The question, they specifically asked for questions about agriculture, questions about urban development, questions about law, questions about economics. And we knew people who had been working on those, that we were able to respond to their requests when what we had been doing had no thought of its relevance in China. You see, it's hard not to think that that there was a wisdom greater than ours that was playing some role.
Yes.
In the course of events. So that's why I use the word providential now.
Yes. You've referred to your own sense of vocation to urge humanity not to destroy itself and the world, the planet. And you've also referred to the Chinese connections. I know that you retired early in order to turn your vocation somewhat differently. Could you say a word about that?
Well, one reason I retired early is because new PhDs were having so much trouble getting jobs that I saw so many professors holding on to jobs that other people needed worse than they did. I didn't want to take part in that.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as much wanting to do what I hadn't been doing. And indeed, retiring threatened the continuation of the Center for Process Studies. So so fortunately, we were able to keep it going. But, and of course, I mean, I did many of the same things after retirement I've been doing before, but I don't really think it was about a change of vocation. It could, I certainly thought that one could work for the slowing down and maybe shifting the direction just as well, not teaching as teaching. I mean, teaching is a wonderful way of doing it, and I'm so proud of some of my students who have done wonderful things. I don't minimize that at all. But there are other ways.
Yeah.
So retiring was not a drastic vocational change.
Yeah.
As I said earlier, my sense of vocation was such that teaching was not necessarily the way.
Yes.
Whereas earlier, that was the only way.
Yeah. As you look back on your life, what do you think were your most important contributions so far?
Well, of course, what turns out to be important is something that is very uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
The contribution that I hope will turn out
Mm-hmm.
to be the most important is participating in redirecting China's rural policy.
Mm. Mm.
Because China was, I mean, what it had announced and what it was doing all looked as though it was going to be another way of copying the United States
Mm. Mm.
and much of the rest of the world, the industrialization of agriculture.
Yeah.
And now, and I think for the last 5 years, probably, that is not what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there are strong moves in the direction of developing the villages rather than bulldozing them down. Well, of course, lots of people have already left the countryside and moved to the cities.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still 500 million people who would be affected by China's agricultural policy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if it turns out that I made a significant contribution to that shift, I would consider that by far the most important thing I did. I get lots more credit for that than I should.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, it's Chinese who have done most of it. But I am now the honorary chair of the Eco-Village movement in China.
Really?
I'm the honorary chair of the ecological agriculture movement in China. So I just mean, I have a reputation for having done a great deal more than I actually did. All I did was, as an American, saying, please don't follow the United States. This has done terrible damage in the United States.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I could do better than the Chinese could.
Yeah.
So obviously I didn't plan my life around.
You've hinted at this, but could you say just a word more about the kinds of shifts that are taking place that you hope will continue?
Well, it is a shift toward actually trying to make life in the villages attractive. See, the villages are fairly miserable places now.
Yeah.
Because the men and often the working age women are going to the cities to earn money.
Yeah.
And the only reason they don't move to the cities is because the government restricts that movement. So to shift from that, with the general idea this would be continued and be finished off, to saying, well, let's see if it'd be possible for villages to become attractive places to live. And I heard that last year, more people moved from cities to villages than from villages to cities.
Wow.
Now, that may have been a freak. You understand, I also know that in China, there within the Politburo, there's more than one faction. And the present faction is the one that has made this shift. It has also reaffirmed classical Chinese thinking. After 100 years of oppression, of Confucianism, now it is referred to in a positive way in presidential speeches and the Society for Confucian Studies. You know, it's just a change of the relationship of the government to classical Chinese thought. And I consider that very positive. The present government today, but it has actually set its growth goal as lower than it could have. And it has also for some years been evaluating governors of provinces, not just according to whether they grow the GDP, but also as to whether they are improving the environment.
Oh,
That's been going on for a decade.
yeah.
We claim a little credit, but mainly it's that there was a connection between what some people in China wanted to do and what we wanted them to do that gave us just astonishing opportunities.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So there's the other faction, which I call the modernizing faction, of course wants to industrialize agriculture and not fool around with all this religious nonsense and not fool around with, or at least not sacrifice growth for the sake of the environment.
Yeah, yeah.
And it may take over at the next meeting. You understand? So when I say that's my greatest contribution, it might all be wiped out within 2 years.
Yeah, yeah. Fragile.
Yeah, it's fragile. That's right.
Um,
My other contribution, I've just come from a meeting of International Process Network, and I was very pleased that when I was at this meeting, I didn't know most of the people.
ah,
You know, 20 or 30 years ago, we'd go to an international whitehead meeting. I already knew everybody.
yes. That is wonderful.
So I think, I feel a little more secure about that. I don't think I make that much difference any longer in that.
Yeah. Which means things have taken root.
Taken root in a lot of different countries around the world.
Yes.
And for reasons that I have no responsibility for. On the continent of Europe, you can study whitehead in universities. At half a dozen universities, you could get your PhD on whitehead.
Wow.
No, that's not something I'm proud of because I didn't do it. But I think if I'm going to say what contribution I've made, I think during a period when whitehead was virtually eliminated from the university world, we kept things alive enough that when people became interested, there was something to be interested in.
And you were one of the founders of the International Process Network.
Oh yes,
You were
oh yes.
so that you helped create the networks.
Yes.
That then could grow in their
I helped create
other
it
ways.
and then avoided any continuing. I don't mean that I totally avoid it, but I don't participate in any of its planning meetings or anything like that. Yeah.
As you look back on your life, what were some of the crises or struggles that you or your family or your institutions had?
Well, during the period, the first few years after finishing at Chicago, I had no sense of a future in which I could do any of the things I had felt called to do. That was, I guess you could call that a crisis. Then when I got the it was there was this opportunity or possible opportunities. The dean of the divinity school wanted to hire me as a faculty member at the divinity school, but the divinity school was part of the federated faculty. And the president of CTS thought that the school had gone too far away from the church, which was true. And so he vetoed my appointment. And that, that was disappointing.
Yeah.
So whether that's exactly what you mean by a crisis, I don't know. But in terms of a sense that I wasn't going to be able to do any of the things I particularly wanted to do, that didn't mean I couldn't have a life as a pastor, and I certainly don't disparage that. I would do better to be a pastor somewhere other than in Appalachia. The church life in Appalachia was so different from anything I had ever experienced before. But that doesn't mean it wouldn't have been possible. And what would have come of that, I have no idea, but I think it's been better the way it worked out.
It did work well. Any other crises?
I mean, of course, there are always little crises, but I think in terms of the family as a whole, that was the only one that I would lift up as a serious crisis. Yeah. Among the questions you listed was, how about the institutions of which you are a part?
Right.
And obviously, the School of Theology has been in crisis after crisis. It has known nothing but crisis. And I've sometimes thought it would be nice to be part of a community that had a little bit of...
less drama.
Yes, a little bit of security. So, and of course, I mean, the crisis that is long-lasting and very important to me as a part of it is the crisis of progressive Protestantism in the United States. And I think it is continuing to fade. I had fantasies of being able to help, but my gestures have not been welcomed, and so I haven't. I felt like I was wasting my time when
Yeah.
I still feel that way. I think I know things the church could do even now that would give it a chance, but.
John, we continue on, if you don't mind, about some of your ideas for progressive Christianity.
Well, I was really talking about specifically what the Methodist Church could do. I mean, that is less vague. For progressive Christianity as a whole, I did organize a group that is known by that, now known as Progressive Christians Uniting. And we thought simply to have a parachurch organization that could articulate something progressive would be, enable people to know that what the newspapers generally report as the Christian view on things was not the only Christian view or even the only Protestant view and so forth. So, I haven't given up altogether. Long ago, a theologian who was much more active than I in denominational affairs, and I teamed up and got the General Conference to vote to set up a commission on the mission of the denomination. And we had ideas of some very simple ones, but they could have been elaborated. But by the time the first meeting took place, it was clear that the insiders didn't want anything to come of this. And my colleague in creating it wouldn't talk to me.
Oh, my.
So to spend 4 years going to meetings the bishop was running it clearly was reflecting a wider decision not to let anything happen. Told me I wasn't a good Methodist church politician. Because nobody would ever talk to me about what was really going on. I mean, I could tell what was going on, but I would have appreciated it if I could have had a conversation in which someone said, the Board of Missions has vetoed this, or whatever. Right. I don't know what the bureaucracy did, but anyway. So that indicates why I haven't been there was a time when I could have become elected by the annual conference to become a general conference delegate. And I've sometimes wondered what I didn't want that at that time. I think anyway, that's just my history of serious thinking.
Yes, yes.
The other things are just thought processes that I think that if the United Methodist Church would take on some particular project, the one that has impressed me as a possibility would be the teaching of compassion. Because there are now, we've had a center at the Center for Process, at the School of Theology, and they really know how to get people to feel and be more compassionate. It can be taught.
Yes.
Well, if lots of local Methodist congregations actually learned how to do that,
Yes.
and promoted that, advertised in the newspapers, whatever you have to do, that if you're interested in becoming more compassionate, we have a program that could give a different image to the denomination as a whole.
It could.
I've also thought that just entirely different if the Methodist Church decided on some outcome, some way of making a difference in the society. Of course, I would like for it to have something to do with saving the world, but suppose it doesn't want to do that. It just wants to deal with the drug problem, okay, which is multifaceted and so forth. It could ask its universities to take on research projects. It could use its seminaries and local congregations could make contributions. If it were known that the Methodist Church really cares about this, I think the resources are all there.
Yeah.
But I've had zero success in even getting bishops to listen to me or anything. So then I've also thought if the Methodist Church would simply say, we want to renew the emphases of John Wesley and do. I think we have the best denominational founder that there is. And it would be harder for Methodists to complain about this as being one. You see, in general, you can't support one theology rather than others. You've got to be neutral with respect to what you believe, which I don't think is a good way to develop a church. But if it's Wesley, it'd be harder for a lot of Methodists to say, oh no, why should we pay any attention to that, Yeah. But I think if really millions of Methodists knew what Wesley's theology was and took it seriously, we would have a revival.
Yeah.
And it would include very different forms of activity. After all, the institutions Wesley created are very different from the current form of the Methodist Church. Those are examples of the kind of thinking which I obviously don't know how to get from fantasy to reality. But I haven't totally given up. If I have a chance to talk to somebody, I will, but I haven't been invited.
I think we need to hear more about this. I appreciate your spinning some specifics. Before we close, could you look back and think about some of the greatest moments of joy in your life?
Well, I've had, as you can tell, I've had lots of joy in my life. Of experience of pure joy is the one experience I've had, which is a kind of purely religious experience, or purely, whatever you want to call it. I have written about it more than once. When I was in the Army, the only thing about that particular context that I can think of that might have had an effect, and I don't know that it did, I was simply practicing the spiritual discipline of praying for the people, whoever I saw around me, you know. And I didn't expect it to have any great effect on me or them, but nevertheless, I mention it because it might have been related. But I knelt beside my bed, and all of a sudden, the room was just full of a presence of total acceptance. And it was bliss.
Beautiful.
Maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's the one experience which makes me think maybe I won't get bored in heaven after all. The idea of living for millions and millions of years just doesn't appeal to me.
Any other moments of joy you want to lift up?
I think that's enough.
Okay. So I'd like you to have the last word with whatever words of wisdom you want to pass on to the next generation.
Well, the problem is I've had so many good breaks because of the specific historical situation at the time. I guess the one thing I would like to say is don't get sucked into whatever the people around you take for granted. It's probably wrong. I think so many people feel like they're very critical and so forth, and yet they're just repeating the same old garbage.
Yeah.
And the truth is so much, well, in a way, in some respects, the truth is so much more encouraging than the lies by which we live, that we ought not to be afraid of it. But I'm a great conspiracy theorist. I think the number of things that happen by single gunmen, all by themselves, outsmarting the FBI and the CIA and everybody else, to me, that's all fantasy. But we have created whole institutions in this country who spend all of that time in conspiring. I mean, what is conspiracy? People talking together, but not telling the rest of the world. What do you think goes on in the CIA? If they don't conspire, they're not earning their salaries.
Yeah.
And above all, I wish people understood that the financial institutions are running the world now. If we really understood that, then we would see how petty are the differences between the Republicans and the Democrats. They'd see a lot of other things, but but until there's some understanding of what's really happening in the world, I don't have much hope for the changes that need to be made. So that's our present historical situation, is one in which the 1% of 1% of 1% of 1% have power of immense importance. No one can be elected president of the United States without their support. So no president of the United States is free to go against what they want. It's not just the president of the United States, it's a lot of other people too. And there are some things we can do to weaken the stranglehold. But since finance is the most extent, we don't live in industrial capitalism, we live in a financial capitalism. And the financial capitalism is able to drain off all the surpluses everywhere into finance. If some of that finance is controlled by the public instead of by private hands, it's a little beginning, a little nibbling at the corner.
Yeah.
We can also learn that if there are people ready to work and the materials are at hand and so forth, we can do things without money. Money is not a necessity in order to accomplish things.
Yeah.
And that would help to break
Yeah.
the stranglehold. But public debt is totally unnecessary. It's used as a way of exerting power over us. There's just so many things that we could do if enough people understood what the real situation was.
And what kind of attitudes and approaches does the next generation or the next generations need to take in order to draw from their own expertise to address the kinds of issues you're talking about?
Well, it needs to be, first of all, the assumption that you don't wait for government to do things. You don't wait for experts to do things. You don't wait for the university to do things. That you take things into your own hands and don't let yourself be bullied by authorities.
It's a pretty strong word. Any other last word?
Thank you.
Thank you, John. This has been inspiring, informative. Thank you so much. And compassionate.
I hope so.
Thank you.